The celestial mapping had been Luca Arton's home for 6 months, which was long enough to memorize every bulkhead pattern and short enough that the recycled air still occasionally made him homesick for Earth's messy, unfiltered atmosphere. He worked in communications, which sounded impressive until you realized it mostly meant troubleshooting translation software and explaining to scientists why their research summaries needed to be under 10,000 words for the weekly report. It wasn't the career he'd imagined when he'd studied xenolinguistics, but it paid for his student loans and occasionally let him feel useful. The ship hummed with its usual background noise, a symphony of ventilation systems and distant engine thrum that Luca had learned to sleep through. He was in the artifact examination lab, triple-checking the environmental controls before their newest passenger arrived. The Ithari scholar, Sira Navin, had a reputation that preceded her like a warning label. Brilliant, the briefing materials said. Exacting. Sensitive to cultural protocols in ways that made diplomatic corps veterans nervous. Luca had been assigned as her liaison, which he suspected was less about his qualifications and more about the fact that everyone else had suddenly discovered urgent commitments elsewhere. He didn't mind. Ithari were rare this far into human-controlled space, and the opportunity to work with one directly was the kind of experience that looked good on a resume. Assuming he didn't accidentally commit some cultural faux pas that sparked an interstellar incident. The lab door hissed open. She entered with the kind of quiet grace that made the sterile room feel suddenly inadequate, like she'd imported atmosphere from somewhere more refined. Her robes were deep blue, layered in a way that suggested formal occasion rather than practical work attire. Her hair was pulled back in an intricate style that probably had cultural significance Luca would never fully understand. And her ears rose from her skull in elegant tapered points, longer than human ears, tilting slightly as she surveyed the space. Luca's brain, that magnificent traitor, immediately supplied the observation that she was strikingly beautiful. Not in a clinical, academic way. In a way that made his carefully prepared greeting evaporate like water on a hot surface. She was examining a holographic display of the artifacts, her attention focused on a fragment of text that rotated slowly in midair. Luca cleared his throat, ready to introduce himself and launch into the professional welcome speech he'd practiced 3 times in the mirror. Sira turned. Her eyes met his, dark and flecked with something that caught the lab's overhead lighting. Her expression shifted into something that might have been amusement or might have been sympathy. When she spoke, her voice had a quality that made standards sound like it was meant to be sung rather than spoken. "Careful human," she said, each word precisely placed. "I can hear everything." Luca's brain performed an emergency stop that would have impressed traffic safety engineers. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Several important cognitive functions went offline simultaneously, while others started screaming for his attention like alarms in a failing spacecraft. "I'm sorry," he managed. His voice came out higher than intended, which was exactly what he needed in this moment of professional introduction. Sira's expression softened into something definitely resembling amusement. She stepped closer, close enough that Luca could smell something like cedar and rain, which seemed impossible on a ship that recycled everything including hope. "Telepathy," she said gently, as if explaining to a child why touching hot surfaces was inadvisable. "Some of my people develop it through years of mental discipline. It's not invasive. I'm not reading your memories or your deep thoughts, but emotions, surface observations, things you're actively thinking." She tilted her head, ears shifting slightly. "Those are louder, like someone speaking in a quiet room." Luca experienced a sensation he would later describe as his entire existence folding inside out. Every thought he'd had in the last 60 seconds paraded through his consciousness like evidence at a trial. The observation about her appearance, the nervousness about making a good impression, the idle wonder about whether Ithari food was any good because the briefing materials hadn't covered that. the completely unhelpful mental note that her ears were fascinating from a biological perspective, and also, "Yes," Sierra said, her amusement now entirely unconcealed. "I can hear all of that too." "This is a nightmare," Luca said. Then, realizing she could hear that thought as well, added, "Not that you're a nightmare. The situation, the telepathy situation, which I'm sure is perfectly normal for you but represents a complete failure of everything I thought I understood about privacy." Sierra laughed. It sounded like something that should be accompanied by better acoustics than a sterile lab could provide. "I apologize for not warning you sooner. Your crew's briefing materials were incomplete. They mentioned cultural sensitivity and proper address protocols, but neglected to mention that some Ethari can hear surface thoughts. That seems like a significant oversight. Humans often find telepathy uncomfortable. Your species values privacy in ways mine doesn't." She gestured toward the artifacts. "Should we begin? Or would you like a moment to compose your thoughts? I promise I'm trying not to listen, but when you're broadcasting this loudly, it's difficult to filter." Luca took a breath, then another one. His mind was still racing, throwing up random observations and anxieties like a malfunctioning search algorithm. He thought about inventory protocols, then about the chemical composition of the ship's hull, then traitorously about how Sierra's eyes had those interesting flecks and whether that was common among her people. "I heard that," she said. "Of course you did." Luca rubbed his face. "This is going to be a long assignment." "Possibly," Sierra agreed, "but potentially interesting. Your thoughts are." She paused, searching for the word. "Honest, chaotic but honest, it's refreshing." "I'm so glad my complete lack of mental discipline is refreshing." She smiled. "Shall we work?" They worked. Sierra explained the artifacts with the kind of passion that made ancient linguistic fragments sound like adventure novels. Luca tried to focus on the actual content, and not on the fact that every stray thought was being broadcast to someone standing 3 feet away. He failed repeatedly. His mind wandered to lunch options, then to whether the environmental controls were too cold, then to appreciation for how clearly Sierra explained complex concepts, then to horror that she just heard him appreciate how clearly she explained complex concepts. "Luca," she said after the fourth time, his concentration visibly derailed, "you're going to exhaust yourself trying to control your thoughts. It's like trying not to breathe. The more you focus on it, the more difficult it becomes." "That's easy for you to say. Your thoughts are private." "Are they?" She tilted her head. "You can read my body language, my expressions, the tone of my voice. You're gathering information about what I'm thinking constantly. Telepathy is just more direct. It's more direct in the way that a nuclear explosion is more direct than a candle." Sierra laughed again. Luca felt absurdly pleased that he'd caused that reaction, then felt embarrassed that she'd definitely heard him feel pleased, then felt frustrated by the entire recursive loop of telepathic awareness. "I'm going to die of self-consciousness," he said. "Humans are remarkably resilient. I suspect you'll survive." She turned back to the artifacts. "Now, this fragment here mentions a form of communication that predates spoken language. I believe it's describing thought-to-thought transfer between species who had no common verbal framework." "So, ancient aliens were dealing with the same telepathy nightmare I'm currently experiencing." "Essentially, yes, though they seem to have approached it with more enthusiasm and less existential panic." Luca laughed despite himself. The sound echoed in the lab's careful sterility, and for a moment the situation felt slightly less catastrophic. He could survive this. Probably. As long as he avoided thinking about anything embarrassing, inappropriate, or honest, which covered approximately 90% of his usual mental activity. Sierra glanced at him, and her expression carried something that might have been sympathy or might have been understanding. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I find your honesty refreshing. Most beings try to hide what they think. You couldn't hide it if you tried. There's something genuine about that." Luca wanted to ask what she meant, but his thoughts were already racing ahead, and he was fairly certain she'd heard every question before he could voice it. So instead, he just nodded and tried to focus on the artifacts, on the ancient languages and the mysteries they represented, and not on the fact that his internal monologue had just become a shared experience. It was definitely going to be a long assignment. 3 days into working with Sira, Luca had developed several coping mechanisms of varying effectiveness. First, he tried thinking in different languages, cycling through the fragments of Mandarin and Spanish he'd retained from university. This worked until Sira gently informed him that telepathy translated concepts, not words, so his attempt to think, "The weather is nice today," in Mandarin still broadcast as a desperate deflection from whatever he was actually feeling. Second, he tried the meditation techniques from a wellness app he downloaded years ago and never used. Breathing exercises, mental quietude, achieving inner peace through focused stillness. This lasted approximately 40 seconds before his mind wandered to whether meditation apps actually helped anyone or just made people feel guilty about not meditating enough. Sira had found that thought particularly amusing. His third and most successful strategy was simply accepting that privacy was a myth and moving forward with his life. It worked surprisingly well, except for the moments when it absolutely didn't. They were in the observation deck, taking a break from the artifacts because even ancient mysteries became tedious after 6 straight hours. The viewport displayed a section of the Helix Nebula, layers of stellar gas in colors that human eyes weren't quite designed to process. Luca had brought coffee that tasted like someone's disappointing interpretation of coffee. Sira had brought Ithari tea that smelled significantly better. "Your coffee is terrible," she said, not looking at him. "I didn't say anything." "But you thought it," very loudly, with visual metaphors involving boot leather. Luca took another sip. "It's not great," he admitted, "but it's caffeinated, which is the primary requirement." Sira passed him her tea without comment. He accepted it because refusing felt ruder than admitting defeat. The tea tasted like flowers and optimism, which was substantially better than boot leather. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." She was quiet for a moment, watching the nebula. "Can I ask you something about human psychology?" "Sure. I make no promises about having good answers, but I can offer mediocre speculation." "Why do humans value privacy so intensely? My people see thoughts as another form of communication. Hiding them feels dishonest, like speaking with your mouth but contradicting yourself with body language." Luca considered the question, while his brain unhelpfully supplied several tangential thoughts about historical privacy debates and the philosophical implications of surveillance states. He felt Sira's attention shift slightly, tracking his mental wandering with what he'd come to recognize as fond exasperation. "I think," he said slowly, "it's because humans don't always like what we're thinking. We have intrusive thoughts, random anxieties, judgments we don't actually believe. If everyone could hear all of that, we'd never stop apologizing for our own minds. But those thoughts don't define you, they're just mental noise." "Sure, but try explaining that when someone hears you think something unkind about their haircut. The thought exists, even if you'd never say it aloud. Privacy lets us choose what we share." Sira nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Though it also sounds exhausting, constantly curating your own thoughts for potential audience. Welcome to being human. It's mostly exhausting with occasional moments of okay." She laughed, and Luca felt absurdly pleased again. He was getting better at not being embarrassed by his own reactions, which Sira claimed was progress. He suspected it was just resignation. They fell into comfortable silence, watching the nebula's slow stellar dance. Luca found his thoughts drifting to how strange this all was, working alongside someone who could hear his mental commentary, someone whose presence had gone from terrifying to familiar in less than a week. He thought about how her laugh had a particular cadence, how she tilted her head when processing complex ideas, how her ears shifted subtly with her moods. He thought, briefly and without meaning to, that he liked having her around. Sierra turned to look at him. Her expression was difficult to read, layered with something that might have been surprise or might have been understanding or might have been something else entirely. "I like having you around too," she said quietly. Luca's brain performed another emergency stop. "I didn't mean, that is, I wasn't trying to." "I know, it was just a thought, an honest one." She paused. "For what it's worth, I've been trying to filter more carefully around you, to give you the illusion of privacy. But your thoughts are loud, emotional, they slip through even when I'm not trying to listen." "Is that a problem?" "No," she said it simply without hesitation. "It's different. Most beings I encounter have learned to modulate their mental volume. Yours is constant, chaotic, entirely unfiltered. It's like listening to a radio that's stuck between stations but somehow still playing music." That's possibly the weirdest compliment I've ever received. I meant it as one. They returned to work after that, but something had shifted. Luca noticed that Sierra seemed to be responding to his thoughts more directly, less concerned about maintaining the polite fiction of not hearing. When he mentally noted that a particular translation seemed awkward, she'd pause and reconsider it. When he had questions about Ithari cultural context, she'd answer them before he voiced them aloud. It should have been intrusive. Instead, it felt like a conversation that had finally dropped pretense and become genuine. The artifact they were currently examining appeared to be a historical record, fragments of text describing something called a thought bridge. Sierra translated in careful standard, her voice taking on the formal cadence she used for official texts. In the time before words carried meaning across the void, the first communicators established bridges between minds. These connections transcended species, language, and the limitations of physical speech. To know another's thoughts was to know their truth unfiltered by the inadequacy of verbal expression. "So ancient aliens were doing the telepathy thing too," Luca said. "Was everyone just okay with zero privacy?" The text suggests it was voluntary, a deliberate choice to form a mental connection with another being. Sierra's ears tilted forward slightly, a sign Luca had learned meant intense focus. It describes the process as requiring mutual consent, sustained mental contact, and, oh, it carries risks. Once established, the bridge is difficult to sever. Thoughts, emotions, even memories can bleed between bonded individuals. The text warns that those who form a bridge must be certain of their commitment, as the connection becomes part of their identity. Luca felt a strange flutter in his chest that he recognized as anxiety mixed with curiosity. "That sounds intense." "Yes." Sierra was still reading, her attention fixed on the fragment. "It also suggests that bridges were formed between different species as a way to foster understanding, to experience another being's perspective directly, without the filter of cultural assumptions or linguistic translation." Did it work? Or did everyone just end up overwhelmed by each other's random thoughts about lunch? She smiled faintly. "The records are incomplete, but the text treats the bridge as something profound, sacred even. Not something entered into lightly." They spent the next hour documenting the finding, recording translations and noting correlations with other artifacts. Luca tried to focus on the work, and not on the strange weight the thought bridge concept had acquired in his mind. The idea of deliberately forming that kind of connection, of choosing to let someone hear everything, feel everything without barriers, felt both terrifying and compelling. Sierra glanced at him. "You're thinking loudly again." "Sorry, don't be. I'm curious too." She set down her translation stylus. "The concept is intriguing from a xenoanthropological perspective, but also from a personal one." "Personal how?" "My people don't typically form deep mental bonds. We can hear surface thoughts, yes, but creating a true bridge, that's rare. It requires vulnerability that most find uncomfortable. Knowing that another being can feel what you feel, think what you think, without any ability to hide or deflect." "That sounds like my current situation, except more so." Much more so. She paused. But also different. Right now you broadcast and I receive. A bridge would be mutual. I would be just as exposed to you as you are to me. Luca tried to imagine what that would be like, hearing Sierra's thoughts the way she heard his. Understanding her perspective without translation or explanation. The idea made something in his chest tighten, with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Would you want that? He asked before his better judgment could stop him. Hypothetically, a bridge like the text describes. Sierra was quiet for a long moment. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled through their patient rotations, indifferent to small questions asked in sterile labs. Hypothetically, she said finally, yes, but not lightly, and not without understanding the risks fully. Makes sense. I wouldn't want to end up mentally attached to someone who thought my coffee metaphors were annoying. She laughed. Your coffee metaphors are terrible, but I'd probably survive them. They returned to work, but the thought bridge stayed with Luca like an unfinished conversation. He kept thinking about what it would mean, that level of connection, that degree of vulnerability. Part of him was terrified by the idea. Another part wondered what it would be like to truly understand someone else, to experience the world through their eyes without the constant friction of miscommunication. And he wondered, though he tried not to think it too loudly, what it would be like specifically with Sierra. She didn't respond to that thought, but her ears tilted slightly, and when she glanced at him, her expression carried something that looked like recognition. The mental discipline lessons began on day 7, which Luca calculated meant they had approximately 6 more days before he either achieved enlightenment or completely lost his mind. Sierra had suggested the training gently, phrasing it as optional professional development rather than an intervention for someone whose thoughts had the subtlety of a marching band in a cathedral. They met in the observation deck during off hours when foot traffic was minimal. Sierra had arranged cushions in front of the viewport, which gave the whole exercise the atmosphere of a meditation retreat organized by someone who'd never actually attended a meditation retreat, but had seen promotional materials. The goal isn't to stop thinking, Sierra explained, settling into a cross-legged position that looked significantly more comfortable than Luca's attempt at the same posture. It's to choose what you broadcast. Think of your thoughts as having volume controls. Right now, everything is at maximum volume all the time. So I need to learn to think quietly. In essence, yes, or at least to think selectively. She gestured for him to sit. Close your eyes. Focus on your breathing. Try to form a single, clear thought and hold it without letting your mind wander. Luca closed his eyes, focused on breathing, which immediately made breathing feel weird and manual. Tried to think of something simple and clear. His mind offered, breathing is weird. These cushions smell like storage. I wonder if this actually works, and Sierra's really patient to put up with this. 15 seconds, Sierra said. You lasted 15 seconds before your focus scattered. Is that good? It's human. Her tone carried amusement. Try again. This time when you notice your mind wandering, gently redirect it. Don't judge the distraction. Just acknowledge it and return to your intended thought. They practiced for an hour. Luca's personal record reached 40 seconds of focused thought before his brain decided that focused thought was boring and started wondering about dinner options. Sierra assured him that this was progress. Luca suspected she was being diplomatic. Let me try something different, she said. Instead of trying to quiet your thoughts, try to intentionally project one. Imagine you're showing me something deliberately, rather than broadcasting everything accidentally. How do I do that? Think of an image, something visual and simple. Hold it in your mind and push it toward me. It sounds abstract, but you'll know when it works. Luca tried. He thought of the nebula outside the viewport, focused on the swirls of stellar gas and the way light bent through cosmic dust. He imagined pushing the image outward, toward where Sierra sat across from him. Nothing happened for several long seconds. Then, like a muscle he hadn't known he possessed, something clicked. He felt the thought move, felt it leave the confines of his own skull and travel the small distance between them. Sierra's eyes widened. I saw it, your perspective of the nebula, the way you perceive color, the associations you make with stellar formation. That was, good, do it again. They practiced projection for another hour. Luca got better at it, though his success rate hovered around 30%. When it worked, the sensation was remarkable, less like speaking and more like sharing a perspective without the lossy compression of language. During their fifth attempt, Luca managed to project a clear image of the artifact lab, filtered through his own perception. The slight anxiety about environmental controls, the appreciation for Sierra's meticulous organization, the way he'd started associating the space with comfortable routine. Sierra received it and went very still. That's how you see our work, with all that emotional context layered through. I guess, is that wrong? No, it's just different. When I think of the lab, I see efficiency and order. You see it as a space made meaningful by shared purpose. She paused. It's a nice perspective. Thanks, I think. She smiled. Now try to receive. I'll project something and you try to sense it. I'm not telepathic. You don't need to be. The bridge we're building is mutual. If I push clearly enough, you should be able to receive. Luca closed his eyes again, trying to quiet the constant chatter of his own thoughts. He felt Sierra's presence like a warmth at the edge of his awareness. And then, an image, the nebula, but seen through different eyes. Sierra's perspective. She perceived colors in ranges Luca couldn't quite process, saw patterns in the stellar gas that spoke of gravitational dynamics and chemical compositions. But layered through it was emotion, wonder at the beauty of it, satisfaction in understanding its mechanics, and something else. Something that felt like contentment. The image faded. Luca opened his eyes to find Sierra watching him. I saw it, he said. Your version of the nebula, it's more complex than mine, you see so much more. Different, not more. You see beauty where I see data. Both perspectives are valid. She tilted her head. Did you feel the emotion underneath? Yeah, contentment, I think. Close. It's what I feel when I'm working with you. Like finding an unexpected harmony in a complicated equation. Luca's brain tried to process that statement and immediately scattered into several competing reactions, all of which he was fairly certain Sierra could hear. He settled on, oh. Yes, she said, oh. They continued practicing, the exercises becoming more comfortable as Luca learned to navigate the strange territory of deliberate mental projection. By the end of their session, he could reliably send simple images and occasionally receive Sierra's projections without conscious effort. You're improving quickly, Sierra said as they packed away the cushions. Most humans I've worked with take weeks to reach this level. Maybe I'm just highly motivated to stop broadcasting my entire mental catalog. Or maybe you're naturally suited for this. She paused at the observation deck exit. Tomorrow, we should try something more complex. Emotional projection, perhaps, sharing not just images but feelings. That sounds intense. It is. But it's also the foundation of what the thought bridge texts describe. True understanding requires sharing not just what we think but what we feel. Luca nodded, already feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness that Sierra definitely heard. She smiled and didn't comment, which he'd learned was her version of kindness. The next day's session started with emotional projection, which turned out to be significantly harder than visual images. Emotions were slippery, contextual, difficult to isolate from the constant background noise of other feelings. Luca tried to project simple things, contentment, curiosity, mild amusement at his own incompetence, and ended up broadcasting complicated tangles of mixed feelings that made Sierra's ears twitch with the effort of parsing them. Humans have very layered emotional responses, she observed after his fifth attempt. You're not just feeling one thing, you're feeling several contradictory things simultaneously. Welcome to consciousness, it's mostly confusion. Try focusing on a memory instead, something with a strong, clear emotional association. Luca thought of home, Not Earth in general, too big, too abstract, but his parents' garden. Summer afternoons, the smell of tomato plants, his mother's laugh when the sprinklers malfunctioned. The memory came with a wash of nostalgia and comfort, uncomplicated by his usual emotional complexity. He pushed it toward Sierra. She received it and went quiet. When she spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "That's beautiful. The way you associate safety with growing things and sunlight, the love embedded in that memory." She paused. "Thank you for sharing it." "Your turn," Luca said, curious now. Sierra closed her eyes briefly. Then he felt it, a memory arriving like a gift. Gardens on her homeworld, but not like Earth gardens. These were vertical, climbing structures that reached toward triple moons. Bioluminescent flowers that sang in frequencies just below hearing. The presence of family, not visual but felt. A sense of belonging woven through every detail. The emotion underneath was similar to what Luca had shared. Safety, home, love, but textured differently, filtered through alien experience. When the memory faded, Luca realized his eyes were wet. "I didn't mean to make you emotional," Sierra said, concerned. "You didn't. I mean, you did, but in a good way. That was incredible, feeling what home means to you." He wiped his eyes, embarrassed but not quite enough to hide it. "Is this what telepathy is always like for you? Experiencing other people's emotions this directly?" "Not usually this intense. Most beings don't share so openly. But yes, essentially. It's why my people value emotional honesty. Hiding becomes impossible. So we've built a culture around accepting what we feel." "That sounds healthier than what humans do." "Different challenges. Your privacy allows for individual processing. Our openness can be overwhelming when emotions are too raw." They practiced emotional sharing for the rest of the session, getting more comfortable with the vulnerability it required. Luca shared his frustration with bureaucracy, his pride when he solved translation puzzles, his affection for the ship despite its many inadequacies. Sierra shared her homesickness, her intellectual excitement about the artifacts, her growing comfort with Luca's chaotic presence. That last one made Luca's heart do something complicated that Sierra definitely felt. She smiled and didn't comment, which was becoming a pattern. 2 weeks into the mental discipline training, something shifted. Luca was working alone in the artifact lab, cross-referencing some translation notes Sierra had made, when he felt a presence at the edge of his awareness. Not intrusive, just there, like someone standing in a doorway. He turned. Sierra was entering the lab, but the feeling had preceded her physical arrival by several seconds. "Did you just sense me coming?" she asked. "I think so. I felt something." The bridge is forming naturally. Small connections building over time through repeated mental contact. She set down her data pad. "We haven't attempted the formal ritual the texts describe, but the foundation is developing anyway." "Is that normal?" "I don't know. The texts aren't clear about whether bridges require intentional ceremony or if prolonged mental intimacy is sufficient." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "How do you feel about it?" Luca considered the question honestly, knowing she'd hear his answer regardless. "Less scared than I expected. It's strange, knowing you're becoming part of my mental landscape. But also, nice. Having someone who understands without explanation. I feel similarly. Your presence has become familiar, comforting even." They stood there in the lab, the artifacts humming quietly in their containment fields, and Luca realized he could feel Sierra's emotions without her deliberately projecting. Her contentment, her curiosity, something deeper that felt like affection but carried nuances he didn't have words for. "Can you feel what I'm feeling right now?" he asked. "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." Luca took a breath. The emotion he'd been trying not to examine too closely sat in his chest like a small sun, impossible to ignore now that he was paying attention. Warmth and want, and something that might have been the early stages of love, if he was being honest with himself, which was mandatory when someone could hear your thoughts. Sierra stepped closer. "I feel it too, in case that wasn't clear." It wasn't actually. You're better at keeping your thoughts quiet than I am. Practice and self-preservation. She smiled, but I'm choosing not to hide this. What I feel when I'm with you, it's not just telepathic rapport, it's more personal than that. Luca's brain short-circuited again, but this time in a significantly more pleasant way. So we're, what? Accidentally forming a mental bond because we work together, and I broadcast at maximum volume constantly. That's part of it, but bonds require more than proximity. They require trust, vulnerability, genuine connection. We've been building that. Without meaning to. Does that matter? Intention versus outcome. Luca thought about it. About how he'd been terrified of Sierra hearing his thoughts 2 weeks ago, and how now he couldn't imagine not sharing them with her. About how the mental discipline exercises had become his favorite part of each day. About how her perspective had started informing his own, her way of seeing the universe making his own vision richer. No, he said. I don't think it matters. Good. Sierra reached out and took his hand. Physical contact after so much mental intimacy felt almost startling. Because I'd like to try something. The formal bridge ritual the texts describe. I want to know what it feels like to connect with you completely, not just in fragments. What if it doesn't work? Or what if it works too well and we can't function independently anymore? Then we'll adapt together. She squeezed his hand. But I don't think it will be a problem. The texts say bridges enhance rather than erase individual identity. We'll still be ourselves, just with a deeper understanding of each other. Luca looked at their joined hands, then at Sierra's face. Her long ears tilted forward with anticipation. Her eyes held something that looked like hope mixed with determination. He could feel her emotions now without trying, nervousness and excitement and absolute certainty that this was what she wanted. Okay, he said. Let's try it. Now, unless you have another ancient ritual scheduled for today. She laughed. No, my calendar is clear of ancient rituals. They moved to the observation deck again, to the familiar cushions and the viewport full of stars. Sierra explained the process as she understood it from the fragmented texts. Sustained mental contact, complete openness on both sides, an intentional choice to lower all barriers and allow their thoughts to merge temporarily. It might not work immediately, she warned. The text suggests it can take hours of sustained effort. I've got nowhere else to be. They sat facing each other close enough that their knees touched. Sierra took both his hands. Close your eyes. Focus on your breathing like in our exercises. But this time, don't try to project a single thought. Try to open your mind completely. Let me in. Luca closed his eyes. Focused on breathing, on the warmth of Sierra's hands, on the presence of her at the edge of his awareness. He tried to relax the mental discipline he'd been learning, to stop controlling the volume of his thoughts and just let go. At first, nothing happened. His thoughts remained his own, bouncing around his skull in their usual chaotic pattern. But gradually, he felt something shift. Sierra's presence grew stronger, not just at the edge of his awareness but moving closer, like someone entering a room. He felt her thoughts brush against his. Not hearing them exactly but feeling them, her focus, her anticipation, her complete trust in him. He pushed back gently, sharing his own readiness, his curiosity about what would happen next. The boundary between them started to blur. Luca felt Sierra's perspective layering over his own, saw the observation deck through her eyes, the stars more vivid in color ranges he couldn't normally perceive, the ambient temperature registering differently against skin with different thermal sensitivity. He felt her physical sensations, the pressure of the cushion beneath her, the warmth of his hands in hers, the way her heartbeat had accelerated slightly. And beneath the physical perceptions, he felt her emotions in full complexity. Not just surface feelings, but the deep architecture of them. Her affection for him, layered with respect and intellectual fascination, and something tender that made his chest ache. Her nervousness about the bridge, not because she doubted him, but because she'd never been this vulnerable with anyone. Her hope that this would work, that they could share this kind of connection. At the same time, he felt Sierra receiving his own perspective. His awe at experiencing her consciousness, his overwhelming affection mixed with the fear of inadequacy, his deep gratitude that she trusted him with this. Every messy, honest, unfiltered feeling he possessed flowing toward her without barrier. The bridge locked into place like a key finding its tumbler. Suddenly, they weren't just sharing thoughts, they were thinking together. Luca could feel Sierra's mind working alongside his own, her processing speed and analytical precision, complementing his intuitive leaps and lateral connections. When he had a question, her knowledge supplied context before he could fully form the inquiry. When she encountered an emotional nuance she didn't understand, his experience filled in the gaps. It was overwhelming and perfect, and utterly unlike anything Luca had imagined. This is incredible, he thought, and Sierra responded in the same moment. Yes. They sat like that for an unmeasured time, learning the landscape of each other's minds. Luca discovered that Sierra's thoughts were structured like music, patterns and harmonies underlying every logical process. She discovered that his thoughts were more like weather patterns, chaotic but with underlying systems that made sense once you understood their logic. Eventually, Luca opened his eyes. Sierra opened hers in the same moment, and he felt her amusement at the synchronization. "We're still individuals," she said aloud, and he felt her relief alongside the words. "The bridge didn't erase our boundaries, it just made them permeable. I can feel what you're feeling. It's like having stereo consciousness. Can you still think privately? Try closing part of your mind to me." Luca focused on creating a mental space that was just his. It took effort, like flexing a muscle he'd just discovered, but he managed it. A small room in his mind that Sierra couldn't access unless he invited her. "It works," he reported. "I can create privacy if I need it." "Good, that's important for maintaining individual identity." She smiled. "Though I suspect you won't use it often. You're not good at hiding things." "Fair point." They stayed in the observation deck for hours, exploring the bridge's capabilities. Luca found that he could share complex concepts with Sierra instantly. No need for verbal explanation, when he could simply show her his entire understanding of a topic. Sierra could ask questions and receive answers at the speed of thought. They could work on translation problems together, their different perspectives merging into solutions neither could have reached alone. But the most profound aspect wasn't the efficiency, it was the intimacy. Luca had never felt so completely known by another person. Sierra understood not just what he thought, but why he thought it, the experiences and fears and hopes that shaped his perspective. And he understood her in the same way, felt the weight of her homesickness, and the joy she found in discovery, and the deep current of affection she carried for him. When Luca thought about kissing her, a thought that arrived without preamble because apparently his brain had no sense of timing, Sierra didn't pull away. Instead, he felt her response through the bridge, curiosity and desire, and the unspoken question of whether this was something he truly wanted or just a fleeting impulse. He answered without words, showing her the depth of what he felt. Not just physical attraction, though that was part of it, but genuine emotional connection. The sense that she'd become essential to his daily experience. The certainty that he wanted to explore this thing between them, whatever it became. Sierra leaned forward and kissed him. The physical sensation was accompanied by emotional resonance that made it unlike anything Luca had experienced. He felt her pleasure alongside his own, the feedback loop of shared emotion intensifying everything. He could feel how she perceived him, the texture of his thoughts, the warmth of his presence in her consciousness, the way he made her feel understood in ways her own people never had. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Sierra laughed quietly. "That was different," she said aloud. "Good different. Very good different." She rested her forehead against his. "I've never shared a moment like that. Experiencing both perspectives simultaneously. We're definitely going to have to write a research paper about this." She laughed again, and he felt the joy of it through the bridge, doubling back on itself in a way that made him laugh too. They eventually returned to the artifact lab, but everything felt different now. Working together had always been comfortable, but now it was seamless. They could coordinate without speaking, anticipate each other's needs, share insights at the speed of thought. When Sierra found a particularly complex passage in the artifacts, Luca could feel her working through the translation in real time, could offer suggestions that integrated perfectly with her analysis. The discovery they made that evening would have taken days to reach separately. Together, through the bridge, they found it in hours. The artifacts described not just the thought bridge itself but its purpose. Ancient civilizations had used bridges to facilitate cooperation between species with radically different modes of thinking. What seemed like insurmountable communication barriers became navigable when beings could share perspectives directly. The bridges had been tools of diplomacy, methods of fostering understanding across difference. They'd also been expressions of profound personal connection. The texts contained fragments of poetry written by bonded pairs, describing the experience of knowing another mind as intimately as their own. Love, the text suggested, took on new dimensions when filtered through complete mutual understanding. "We should report this to command," Sierra said, but he felt her reluctance through the bridge. Why reluctant? Because they'll want to study us, document the bridge's effects, turn our personal experience into data. Would that be so bad? If it helps other people form bridges, understand each other better. Sierra considered it. He felt her working through the ethical implications, weighing personal privacy against potential collective benefit. No, she concluded. Not bad, just invasive, but perhaps worthwhile. They filed their report the next morning. Commander Reeves responded with predictable concern about security implications. What if enemies formed bridges to extract classified information? What about psychological risks? Had they considered the long-term effects? Luca and Sierra fielded questions for 3 hours, both separately and together. The bridge made lying impossible, which worked in their favor. Command couldn't doubt the authenticity of their findings when both of them shared identical perspectives on every detail. Eventually, Reeves sighed in the way of people realizing they were dealing with something too complex for standard protocol. "You're both adults," he said. "You've documented informed consent. The bridge appears stable. Against my better judgment, I'm authorizing you to continue your work while monitoring the bond's effects." He fixed them both with a stern look. "But if this compromises ship security or either of your well-being, we're revisiting this decision." "Understood," they said in unison, then felt each other's amusement at the synchronization. Over the following weeks, Luca and Sierra became something unprecedented on the celestial mapping, the first documented human-Ethari bonded pair. Other crew members treated them with a mix of curiosity and caution, unsure how to interact with people who were functionally two individuals operating as a coordinated unit. The bridge required maintenance, regular mental exercises to keep the connection clear, deliberate periods of separation, to preserve individual identity. Luca learned to create private mental space when he needed solitude. Sierra learned to give him that space without feeling excluded. But mostly, they learned to exist in the strange territory between separate and merged. They were still themselves, Luca with his chaotic thoughts and self-deprecating humor, Sierra with her analytical precision and subtle warmth. But they were also something new, a partnership that operated on levels humans and Ethari had never achieved. 3 months after forming the bridge, they were working late in the artifact lab when Luca felt a question forming in Sierra's mind before she voiced it. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Forming the bridge, losing your privacy?" He considered the question honestly, examining his feelings without filter. "No, not even a little. You were right. The bridge didn't erase who I am. It just gave me someone who understands completely. Even when my understanding includes all your most embarrassing thoughts. Especially then, because you hear all that and still choose to be here." Sierra smiled and reached for his hand. Through the bridge, he felt her certainty, her contentment, her deep affection that had grown into something neither of them had quite named yet but both recognized. "I choose this," she said, "every day." Me too. Outside the viewport, stars continued their ancient dance through the void. And in the lab, two minds touched and held, understanding each other in ways that transcended language, species, and every barrier that had once seemed insurmountable. Luca's thoughts were still loud, chaotic, entirely unfiltered. But now someone was listening by choice, and that made all the difference.